In the year 1885, within the somber, towering stone walls of Windsor Castle, a child was born into the heart of the British Empire. Princess Alice of Battenberg entered a world of immense privilege and rigid expectation. Beneath the watchful eyes of her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, her life seemed destined for the scripted elegance of the Victorian court. Yet, as the flickering candlelight danced across her cradle, a hidden truth began to emerge. The grandeur of the castle, with its hushed corridors and whispered secrets, would soon become a silent stage for a girl who could not hear the world around her, setting the foundation for a life defined by resilience. As Alice grew, the silence around her became a mystery to her family. While other children responded to the chiming of the great clocks or the calls of the guards, Alice remained in a world of quiet observation. Her mother, Princess Victoria, eventually realized that her daughter was congenitally deaf. In an era where such a condition often led to isolation or institutionalization, the discovery was a devastating blow to the royal household. However, instead of hiding her away, her family sought to understand the silent barrier that separated Alice from the vibrant, noisy world of the late 19th century British aristocracy. Queen Victoria, a woman of iron will, took a keen interest in her great-granddaughter's development. She insisted that Alice should not be treated as a victim of her circumstances. Under the Queen's stern but watchful eye, Alice was encouraged to overcome her disability through sheer determination. The royal court, usually filled with music and gossip, became a place of intense study for the young princess. This period marked the beginning of Alice's journey to bridge the gap between her silent world and the vocal world of royalty. Fueled by the matriarch's demand for strength and the family's refusal to let her fade into the background, Alice's education was rigorous and unconventional. She was taught to read lips not just in English, but in German and later in French and Greek. This was a monumental task that required immense focus and hours of practice. While other royals spent their time in leisure, Alice spent hers staring intently at the mouths of her tutors, deciphering the subtle movements of speech. Her world was one of visual cues and vibrations. This mastery of lip reading became her greatest tool, allowing her to navigate the complex social webs of European royalty without ever hearing a single word spoken by her peers. Despite her ability to communicate, Alice often felt the weight of her isolation. She lived in the interstices of sound, observing the laughter and arguments of the court like a phantom. This sense of being an outsider, even within her own family, forged a deep internal strength. She became an expert observer of human nature, noticing the flickers of deceit or kindness that others missed. Her silence was not a void, but a vantage point. The muted colors of her world were filled with the rich textures of visual emotion, making her more attuned to the suffering and needs of those around her as she matured. In 1902, at the coronation of her uncle, King Edward VII, Alice met a man who would change the course of her life. Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark. Andrew was captivated by her beauty and her extraordinary ability to engage in conversation despite her deafness. Their meeting was a spark of light in the often rigid corridors of royal duty. For Alice, Andrew represented a new world and a chance for a life of her own. Their courtship was conducted through letters and the careful reading of lips, a quiet romance blossoming amidst the grand, echoing chambers of the European monarchies. The wedding of Princess Alice and Prince Andrew in 1903 was a grand affair, bringing together the disparate royal houses of Europe. It was held in Darmstadt, the ancestral home of her mother. The ceremony was a spectacle of tradition and power, yet for Alice, it was a profound, personal transition. She was leaving the familiar, silent halls of her British and German upbringing for the sun-drenched, yet politically volatile landscape of Greece. As she stood at the altar, the weight of the crown and the expectations of two nations rested on her shoulders, all while she navigated the ceremony through visual cues alone, to adapt quickly, learning the Greek to adapt quickly, learning the Greek language through her lip-reading skills while managing the demands of a growing family. She gave birth to 4 daughters in quick succession, creating a world of her own within the royal palace in Athens. However, the shadows of unrest were never far away. The mystery of her new home was not just in its language, but in its volatile heart, as the Greek monarchy faced constant threats from internal and external forces. The outbreak of the Balkan Wars in 1912 provided Alice with her first opportunity to prove her bravery and commitment to service. While many in her position would have fled to safety, Alice chose to stay and help. She organized field hospitals and worked tirelessly as a nurse, tending to the wounded and dying. Her deafness, which many had seen as a weakness, became a source of calm in the chaos of the infirmaries. She could not hear the screams of the soldiers, but she could see their pain and feel their fear, responding with a quiet, steady hand that won her the respect of the nation. Despite her service, the tide of history turned against the Greek royal family. Political upheaval led to their first period of exile, forcing Alice and her children to flee the country they had come to call home. This displacement was the beginning of a long and tragic fracturing of Alice's life. The stability she had fought so hard to build was shattered, and the mental strain of the constant turmoil began to take its toll. As she looked back at the receding shoreline of Greece, the silence of her world was now filled with the heavy shadows of an uncertain and difficult future. In the outskirts of Paris, Alice and her family settled into a life of diminished grandeur at Saint-Cloud. The transition from royal duties to the quiet of exile was jarring. For Alice, the external silence she had always known began to be filled by internal whispers. She turned inward, seeking solace in deep religious devotion that soon bordered on the obsessive. Her surroundings, once vibrant with the hope of Greek restoration, now felt cold and alien. The weight of her family's displacement pressed heavily upon her, and those close to her began to notice a troubling change in her temperament and her perception of reality. By 1930, Alice's behavior grew increasingly erratic, leading her family to seek professional medical intervention. She claimed to be receiving divine messages and possessed of healing powers, delusions that deeply alarmed her husband, Prince Andrew. The medical experts of the day, including the influence of Sigmund Freud, viewed her condition through a harsh, contemporary lens. They diagnosed her with paranoid schizophrenia, suggesting that her religious fervor was a symptom of a deeper fracture. The once brave princess was now viewed as a patient, her autonomy slipping away as the men in her life decided her fate behind closed doors. The decision was made to commit Alice to a sanatorium against her will. It was a heart-wrenching scene as she was forcibly separated from her children and husband. The betrayal she felt was profound. The very people she had served and loved were now the ones orchestrating her confinement. As she was escorted away to the Kreuzlingen Sanatorium in Switzerland, Alice's world fractured completely. The isolation of her deafness was now compounded by the physical walls of an asylum, leaving her trapped in a silent, terrifying limbo where her pleas for freedom were ignored by those who claimed to be helping her. At Bellevue Sanatorium, Alice was placed under the care of Dr. Ludwig Benswanger. The treatments of the era were experimental and often cruel, designed to repress her delusions rather than understand her spirit. She was subjected to various procedures that left her physically and mentally exhausted. In the sterile, quiet halls of the institution, Alice fought to maintain a sense of herself. She spent her days in forced reflection, her only outlet being letters that were often censored or never sent. The vibrant princess who had walked through the fire of war was now a prisoner of a medical system that didn't understand her silence. While Alice was confined, her family continued to fracture. Her daughters married German princes in quick succession, ceremonies Alice was unable to attend. Her youngest child, Philip, was sent away to various boarding schools and relatives, effectively growing up without the presence of his mother or the stability of a permanent home. The distance between Alice and her children grew not just in miles, but in the shared experiences they were missing. In her moments of clarity, the realization of her family's disintegration was more painful than any medical treatment, adding a layer of profound grief to her already burdened soul. Within the walls of Bellevue, Alice's spiritual delusions took on a more complex form. She believed she was a bride of Christ, and that she possessed a sacred light that could protect others. These visions were her shield against the harsh reality of her surroundings. However, to the doctors, these were merely symptoms to be managed with aggressive therapies. Alice's inner world was a tapestry of ancient mysteries and divine purpose, a stark contrast to the cold, clinical observations recorded in her medical charts. She lived in a duality of perceived holiness and diagnosed madness, a struggle that defined her years of captivity. For Alice, the sanatorium was a place of double silence. Already deaf, the lack of communication in a language she could understand, sign language or lip reading in her native tongues, made her isolation absolute. The staff often spoke about her as if she weren't there, their voices lost to her. This forced disconnection led Alice to further retreat into her mind. She became a keen observer of the shadows on the wall and the passage of light through her window, finding patterns in the stillness. Her resilience was tested daily as she fought to keep her identity from being erased by the silence of her environment. As the years passed, Alice remained a forgotten figure in the royal circles of Europe. News of the world reached her in fragments: political shifts, the rising tensions in Germany, and the deaths of relatives. Each piece of news was a reminder of the life she once led and the world that was moving on without her. Her status as a princess provided no protection from the obscurity of the sanatorium. She was a ghost of the old order, a relic of a pre-war era trapped in a modern psychiatric facility. Yet, in this forced hibernation, a new, stronger version of Alice was slowly beginning to form. The physical toll of her confinement and treatments began to show. Alice's hair turned gray, and her gaze, once sharp and commanding, now often held a look of weary resignation. She had lost years of her life to a diagnosis that many modern historians now question. Her identity had been stripped down to that of a patient, yet she never lost her inherent dignity. She began to refuse certain treatments, asserting what little will she had left. This subtle rebellion was the first sign that the determined Alice was returning, preparing herself for a life beyond the locked doors of the institution, no matter how fractured that life might be. In late 1932, Alice was finally released from Bellevue, though she did not return to her husband or her previous life. Instead, she chose a path of nomadic independence, traveling across Europe under a pseudonym. She was a woman without a country and a mother without a home, yet she felt a sense of liberation for the first time in years. This wandering period was essential for her to reconcile her spiritual beliefs with the reality of her experiences. Alice was no longer just a princess or a patient. She was a seeker, searching for a way to use her life for a higher purpose in a world on the brink of another great conflict. In 1938, The wandering years ended as Princess Alice returned to Athens, a city she once called home, but now viewed through the eyes of a stranger. The Greek monarchy had been restored, yet the air was thick with the impending dread of European conflict. She settled into a modest flat on Kumbari Street, eschewing the luxuries of the palace. Living on a meager pension, she dedicated her days to the poor, finding that her own experiences of isolation allowed her to connect deeply with those on the fringes of society, preparing her for the trials to come. Alice's reunion with her husband, Prince Andrew, was brief and melancholic. The years of forced separation and her long stay at Bellevue had carved an unbridgeable chasm between them. While they remained legally wed, they were effectively leading separate lives. Andrew lived in the south of France, a ghost of his former military self, while Alice remained in Greece, driven by a newfound religious conviction. This final parting was not one of anger, but of a quiet, somber acceptance that their paths had diverged forever in the wake of tragedy and time, leaving Alice truly independent. When the Second World War finally erupted in 1939, the European royal families were fractured across enemy lines. Alice found herself in a precarious position. Her son, Philip, was serving in the British Royal Navy, while her daughters were married to German princes. Despite the immense pressure to flee to the safety of neutral territory, Alice refused to abandon the people of Athens. She chose to remain in the heart of the storm, a lone figure of royalty staying behind as the shadows of occupation began to stretch across the Mediterranean, her loyalty now belonging to the suffering rather than her lineage. By April 1941, the swastika flew over the Acropolis. Athens fell under a brutal Nazi occupation, and the city was plunged into a nightmare of starvation and fear. Alice, now living in her sister-in-law's palace to protect the property, became a beacon of quiet defiance. The German authorities were wary of her royal connections, yet they underestimated the steel beneath her humble exterior. Amidst the checkpoints and the constant presence of armed soldiers, Alice moved through the streets with a purpose that transcended the political chaos, focused solely on the survival of the innocent in a city under siege. Princess Alice threw herself into humanitarian work, organizing soup kitchens for the starving population. She often ignored the curfews, walking the dark streets of Athens to deliver medical supplies and food. Her deafness, once a source of social isolation, became a tool for survival. She claimed she could not hear the orders of the patrol guards, allowing her to bypass restrictions that grounded others. She lived on almost nothing, giving away her own rations until she was perilously thin, her face etched with the exhaustion of a woman carrying the weight of a city's survival on her shoulders. In 1943, the persecution of Greek Jews intensified. Alice was approached by the family of Hymaki Cohen, a former member of parliament who had aided the royal family years earlier. Without hesitation, Alice hid Rachel Cohen and two of her children in her own apartment. This was an act of immense bravery. The Gestapo headquarters were only blocks away. For over a year, Alice kept their presence a secret from everyone, including her own staff, risking execution to repay a debt of honor and to uphold her personal moral code against the tide of hate sweeping Europe. Utilized her deafness with brilliant calculation. She pretended she could not understand their questions, forcing the frustrated officers to repeat themselves or write things down, which she then misinterpreted with a vacant, polite smile. Her performance was so convincing and her royal status so intimidating that the officers eventually left, convinced she was merely a confused, elderly woman. Behind the closed door, Alice exhaled, her heart racing as her secret remained safe for another day, her bravery hidden behind a mask. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, The Great Famine killed hundreds of thousands in Greece. Alice witnessed the horror firsthand, seeing bodies piled in the streets of Athens. She refused to use her status to secure extra food, choosing to suffer alongside the citizens. Her letters to her family during this time were sparse and devoid of complaint, focusing instead on the spiritual strength she found in the midst of suffering. She had become a living saint to the locals, a princess who had traded her crown for an apron and her palace for the service of the dying in a landscape of despair. The war created a cruel emotional landscape for Alice. She received news of her daughter's lives in Germany through clandestine channels, knowing they were the wives of men high in the Nazi hierarchy. The irony was agonizing. She was hiding Jewish refugees from the very regime her daughters were tied to by marriage. This internal conflict was a silent burden she carried, never allowing it to waver her commitment to the Cohens. Her love for her children remained, but her loyalty to humanity and her faith took precedence over the blood ties that had once defined her life, creating a private, royal tragedy. In October 1944, the German forces finally retreated, and Athens was liberated. However, the joy was short-lived as the city descended into a violent civil war. Alice remained, her apartment still a refuge for those in need. When the British forces arrived, they were shocked to find the king's mother living in such austere conditions, often under fire from snipers. When warned of the danger, Alice famously replied that she was used to the sound of gunfire. She emerged from the war not as a victim of her circumstances, but as a woman of iron will and profound, quiet compassion. As the smoke cleared over Athens, the profound scars of the global conflict remained visible within Alice's own family. While she had risked everything to hide the Cohen family, several of her daughters had married high-ranking German officers. This ideological rift created a silent, heavy chasm during the post-war years. Alice, ever the pragmatist, did not engage in political theater. She focused on the tangible suffering of her neighbors. The liberation brought no comfort to her soul, only a renewed sense of duty. She stood as a bridge between a shattered past and an uncertain future, carrying the weight of her family's divided loyalties with a stoic, mournful grace. In 1947, a rare moment of joy arrived. The marriage of her son, Philip, to Princess Elizabeth of the United Kingdom. Alice traveled to London, a city still rationing food and clearing rubble. Amidst the glittering tiaras and velvet robes of the British aristocracy, Alice was a jarring, singular figure. She had sold her remaining jewels to fund her charitable works, arriving in a simple, modest dress that defied royal protocol. Her presence was a reminder of the hardships of the continent, a silent witness to a decade of survival. She watched her son take his place in history, her pride hidden behind a mask of disciplined composure. Inspired by the memory of her aunt, the Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, who had been martyred by the Bolsheviks, Alice decided to formalize her devotion to the poor. In 1949, she founded the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary. This was not a contemplative order of cloistered prayer, but a nursing order dedicated to active service. She donned a gray nun's habit and a flowing veil, symbols of her total renunciation of worldly status. In the eyes of the public, the mother of the future Duke of Edinburgh had vanished, replaced by a humble servant of the marginalized, a woman who sought God in the gutters of Athens. Alice established the sisterhood's headquarters on the island of Tinos, a place of rugged beauty and deep religious significance. She envisioned a sanctuary that included an orphanage and a convalescent home. However, funding was perpetually scarce. To keep the doors open, Alice lived in extreme poverty, often skipping meals and sleeping on a hard cot. She was a royal who had chosen the life of a peasant, navigating the rocky terrain of the island to visit the sick. Her determination was absolute. She refused to let her deafness or her age hinder her mission to heal a broken community. In a bold move to secure the future of her order, Alice embarked on a fundraising tour of the United States. The American public was fascinated and perplexed by the sight of a European princess appearing in the habit of a nun. She moved through the high society circles of New York and Washington, not as a socialite, but as a beggar for the poor. Her directness and lack of pretension won many hearts. Though the financial success of the trip was modest, she remained undeterred, viewing every obstacle as a test of her faith. To Alice, the gold of her lineage was only valuable if it could be traded for bread. In 1953, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II brought the eyes of the world to London. Once again, Alice occupied a unique position. While the royal family adorned themselves in coronation robes and priceless gems, Alice attended in her simple gray habit and veil. She sat amongst the peers of the realm, a quiet reminder of the vows she had taken. The contrast was profound. She was the mother of the consort, yet she appeared as a humble petitioner. This image of the nun princess became iconic, capturing the public's imagination and highlighting her transition from a life of privilege to a life of profound spiritual service. As the years passed, the physical toll of Alice's lifestyle began to show. Her health, already fragile from years of neglect and the stress of the war, started to decline. Yet, she refused to abandon her work. She spent her days in the wards of her infirmary, her presence providing comfort to those who had been forgotten by society. She communicated with the patients through touch and intense eye contact, her deafness never an obstacle to empathy. Her life was a testament to the idea that true royalty was found in service, not in titles. She was becoming a legend, though she remained entirely indifferent to her own fame. In April 1967, the political stability of Greece collapsed. A military coup, known as the regime of the colonels, seized power, and tanks rolled through the streets of Athens. Alice, once again caught in the crosshairs of history, found herself in immediate danger. Her apartment was located near the center of the unrest, and the sound of gunfire returned to her world. Despite the pleas of her family to flee, she remained resolute, refusing to leave the people she served. She was a woman of iron will, her courage forged in the fires of 2 world wars and a lifetime of personal loss. The situation in Greece became increasingly precarious for the royal family. Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth, deeply concerned for Alice's safety, sent a personal envoy to convince her to return to England. Alice initially resisted, viewing her departure as a desertion of her post. It took a direct, heartfelt appeal from her son to finally move her. She packed her few possessions, mostly religious icons and letters, and prepared to leave the country that had been her home for decades. Her departure was bittersweet. She was escaping the violence, but she was leaving behind the mission that had defined her later years. Alice arrived at Buckingham Palace in 1967, a figure of mystery and quiet dignity. She was given a suite of rooms, but she remained true to her ascetic lifestyle. The palace staff were often surprised to see a chain-smoking nun wandering the grand corridors in the middle of the night. She and Philip finally had the time to reconnect, their bond strengthened by years of distance and mutual respect. Though she was now living in the lap of luxury, her heart remained with the poor. She was the forgotten princess who had come home, a ghost of a bygone era living within the walls of a modern monarchy. Inside the gilded cage of Buckingham Palace, Princess Alice remained an anomaly. While the world outside embraced the swinging 60s, she moved through the velvet-lined corridors like a shadow from a distant century. Her suite was filled with the scent of Woodbine cigarettes and the silent echoes of her prayers. Despite the opulence surrounding her, Alice possessed almost nothing. She had given away her jewels, her titles, and her wealth to those in need. To the palace staff, she was a figure of quiet reverence, a woman who had traded the crown of a princess for the humble habit of a nun, finding her true purpose in the silence of her own world. Prince Philip often visited his mother in the quiet hours of the evening. In these private moments, the Duke of Edinburgh was no longer the public consort, but a son seeking the wisdom of a mother he had nearly lost to history. They spoke of the past, of Greece, and of the family that had been scattered by war and revolution. Alice, though her hearing was gone, understood him through the rhythm of his presence and the shared language of their history. Their relationship, once fractured by her illness and his exile, had finally found a peaceful harbor within the palace walls, anchored by a deep, unspoken respect. As 1968 turned into 1969, Alice's health began to falter. The years of self-imposed hardship and the strain of a life lived for others had taken their toll on her frail frame. Yet, her spirit remained indomitable. She refused the comforts that the Queen offered, preferring her simple bed and her books of devotion. She was a woman who had seen the rise and fall of empires, and she faced her own decline with the same stoicism that had carried her through the Nazi occupation of Athens. In the quiet of her room, she prepared for her final journey, her faith a steady light in the encroaching darkness. The Queen and the Queen Mother often visited Alice, treating the aged nun with the highest honor. To them, she was not just a relative, but a living link to Queen Victoria and the old world of European royalty. They listened as Alice, in her soft, accented voice, recounted stories of courage and faith. She spoke of the Cohen family she had hidden from the Gestapo, not as an act of heroism, but as a simple duty to humanity. In these exchanges, the British royal family saw a side of royalty that was not about power or pageantry, but about the profound weight of moral responsibility. Alice's thoughts often drifted back to Jerusalem, to the Mount of Olives where her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, was buried. Elizabeth, another princess who had become a nun and a martyr, was Alice's spiritual North Star. Alice expressed a final, controversial wish. She wanted to be buried near her aunt in the Church of Mary Magdalene. When her family pointed out the logistical difficulties of such a request in a divided land, Alice simply replied that she would not be there to care about the trouble. Her heart was already moving toward the Holy City, far from the cold stones of London. In the winter of 1969, the palace felt colder to those who knew Alice was fading. She spent her days in meditation, her silence no longer a barrier, but a sanctuary. She had lived through 2 world wars, exile, psychiatric institutionalization, and the loss of her home, yet she remained unbroken. Her presence in the palace was a reminder that true nobility was found in the service of others. As she looked out over the gray London skyline, she knew her work was finished. She had seen her children settled and her family restored, and she was ready to lay down her heavy burden. On the morning of December 5th, 1969, the long and extraordinary life of Princess Alice of Battenberg came to a quiet end. She passed away in her sleep at Buckingham Palace, aged 84. There were no grand pronouncements at the moment of her death. She slipped away as quietly as she had lived within the palace walls. The forgotten princess left behind no riches, only a few personal effects and the memory of her unwavering bravery. The woman who had been born in the presence of Queen Victoria died in the reign of her daughter-in-law's daughter, a bridge between two vastly different worlds. The news of her death was met with a mix of sadness and deep reflection by the royal family. Prince Philip, though prepared, felt the loss of his mother profoundly. She had been his most enduring connection to his roots and the most complex figure in his life. As the palace began the somber preparations for her funeral, the world began to rediscover the story of the princess who had saved Jews from the Holocaust and walked the streets of Athens as a humble nun. Her life, once hidden by the shadows of scandal and illness, was finally being seen in its true, heroic light. Alice was initially interred in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The funeral was a dignified affair, attended by the royalty of Europe who came to pay their respects to the woman who had lived so selflessly. But even as she was laid to rest in the heart of the British monarchy, her final wish remained unfulfilled. Her body lay among kings and queens, but her spirit yearned for the olive groves of Jerusalem. It would take nearly 2 decades for the political and familial obstacles to be cleared, ensuring that the princess who never quite fit into a palace could finally find her true home. The story of Princess Alice did not end with her death. It was only the beginning of her canonization in the hearts of the people. Years later, her heroic actions during the war would lead her to be named righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. She was a woman of contradictions, a princess who lived like a pauper, a deaf woman who heard the cries of the suffering, and a royal who found her greatest strength in humility. As her family prepared to honor her final request, the legacy of Alice of Battenberg began to shine as a testament to the power of a determined and brave heart. Before her passing, Alice had made a startling request that initially perplexed her children. She wished to be buried not in the royal vaults of Windsor, but in Jerusalem, at the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives. She wanted to lie near her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, who had also dedicated her life to the poor as a nun and was murdered during the Russian Revolution. To Alice, this was not about politics or geography. It was about the soul's resting place. Her family, however, feared the logistical and diplomatic hurdles of such a burial in a volatile region. Initially, Alice's body was placed in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. For nearly 20 years, her lead-lined coffin rested among kings and queens, a temporary home for a woman who had long since abandoned the trappings of royalty. The vault was a place of cold stone and heavy silence, echoing the isolation she had often felt during her life. Yet even in this grand setting, her presence felt distinct, a humble nun resting amidst the gold and marble of the British monarchy. The discrepancy between her life of service and this final regal surroundings was a constant reminder of her unique journey. It was not until 1988, nearly 2 decades after her death, that Alice's final wish was finally fulfilled. Her remains were moved from the royal vault at Windsor to her desired resting place in Jerusalem. This journey across continents mirrored her own life's wandering, from the palaces of England and Greece to the quiet, dusty streets of the Holy Land. The transfer was conducted with great solemnity, marking the return of a forgotten princess to a place of spiritual significance. As her casket was transported, the weight of her life's struggles and her ultimate devotion to her faith were felt by all who remembered her. The Church of St. Mary Magdalene, with its iconic golden onion domes, stands on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. It was here that Alice was finally laid to rest, in a crypt beneath the church she had so admired. The setting was a stark contrast to the grey rain of London. Here the light was golden and ancient, reflecting the deep spiritual roots she had sought throughout her life. In this sacred ground, she was no longer a princess or a political figure, but simply Sister Alice, a woman who had found peace in the service of others and God. In 1994, Prince Philip traveled to Jerusalem to honor his mother at Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center. It was a historic and deeply personal visit, as he accepted the title of Righteous Among the Nations on her behalf. Standing before the memorial, Philip spoke of his mother's quiet bravery, noting that she never thought her actions were extraordinary. To her, helping the Cohens was simply what a person of conscience did. This recognition brought Alice's story out of the shadows and into the light of history, validating the quiet heroism that had defined her later years in war-torn Athens. The testimony of the Cohen family played a vital role in Alice being recognized as righteous among the nations. During the Nazi occupation of Athens, Rachel Cohen and her children were hidden by Alice in her small apartment. Despite the Gestapo's headquarters being nearby, Alice used her deafness to her advantage, pretending she couldn't understand their questions during inspections. Her courageous defiance saved the family from certain death. This act of bravery, hidden for decades, finally became the centerpiece of her legacy, proving that even in the darkest times, one individual's moral clarity can shine as a beacon of hope. A tree was planted in Alice's honor in the Garden of the Righteous at Yad Vashem. This simple, living memorial stood as a testament to her growth from a vulnerable young princess to a pillar of strength. The roots of the tree, digging into the ancient soil of Jerusalem, mirrored Alice's own search for a foundation of faith and purpose. Visitors from around the world would come to see her name etched in stone, learning the story of the deaf princess who became a savior. The tree, like Alice, flourished in a difficult environment, a symbol of resilience and life. Throughout her life, Alice's deafness was often viewed as a disability, but she transformed it into a unique source of strength. It allowed her to develop a profound internal world, a quiet sanctuary where the noise of royal expectations could not reach her. In her silence, she learned to listen to the suffering of others with her heart. This empathy was the driving force behind her work with the poor and her bravery during the war. Her life proved that what the world perceives as a weakness can, with determination and faith, become the very instrument of a person's greatest triumph. By the end of her life, Alice had given away almost every possession she owned. The jewelry that had once signaled her status as a princess had long been sold to fund her nursing order and feed the hungry. She died with nothing but her faith and her habit. This total renunciation of worldly wealth was her final victory over the constraints of her birth. She had found a wealth that could not be taken away, the love of those she served, and the peace of a clear conscience. Her story remains a powerful critique of the emptiness of titles and the enduring value of service. The legacy of Alice of Battenberg is a tapestry of contradictions. A princess who became a pauper, a woman of silence who spoke volumes through her actions, and a royal who found her true home among the suffering. Her journey from the splendor of Windsor to the humble crypt in Jerusalem is a reminder that the most profound lives are often those lived in service to others. Alice's story continues to inspire, a testament to the fact that bravery is not the absence of fear or struggle, but the determination to do what is right, regardless of the cost. By 1938, the clouds of war were gathering over Europe, but Princess Alice chose to return to Athens alone. While her daughters were married to German princes and her son Philip was serving in the British Royal Navy, Alice found herself in a precarious position. She lived in a small, modest flat, a far cry from the palaces of her youth. As the Nazi shadow lengthened across the continent, she remained steadfast, refusing to flee the city she had come to call home. Her deafness, once a source of isolation, now became a wall of silence behind which she could observe the changing world with a quiet, penetrating clarity. In April 1941, the German occupation of Greece began. The streets of Athens were filled with the rhythmic stomp of jackboots and the chilling sight of the swastika flying over the Parthenon. Alice, however, did not flinch. When a German general arrived at her door to ask if there was anything he could do for the sister-in-law of the Kaiser's daughter, she looked him directly in the eye and famously replied, "You can take your troops out of my country." It was a moment of immense bravery, a royal defiance delivered with the quiet dignity of a woman who feared no earthly power. During the darkest hours of the Holocaust, Alice's courage transcended mere words. When the Gestapo began rounding up the Jewish population of Athens, Alice acted. She hid Rachel Cohen, the widow of a former member of parliament, and 2 of her children in her own home. The Cohens were the family of Haimaki Cohen, who had aided King George I years earlier. Alice remembered the debt of honor. For months, they lived in a concealed space, with Alice personally bringing them food and supplies, her royal status serving as a shield that the occupiers hesitated to pierce. The Gestapo eventually grew suspicious and came to interrogate the princess. Alice, drawing upon her lifelong experience with deafness, turned her disability into a strategic defense. She pretended she could not understand their questions, forcing the frustrated officers to repeat themselves or speak louder, which allowed her to stall and feign confusion. Her calm, unblinking gaze and her refusal to be intimidated eventually exhausted the interrogators. They left her home empty-handed, never discovering the Jewish family hidden just a few feet away. It was a masterclass in psychological resistance, born from a lifetime of navigating a silent world. While she risked her life for the Cohens, Alice also worked tirelessly for the starving people of Athens. She organized soup kitchens and worked for the Red Cross, ignoring the risks of the ongoing conflict. She became a familiar sight on the streets, often seen carrying supplies to those in need, her tall frame draped in a simple nurse's uniform. She had no money of her own. She had sold her jewels and family heirlooms to fund her charitable works. The Princess of Battenberg had truly become a servant of the poor, finding her purpose in the shared suffering of her adopted nation. When Athens was finally liberated in 1944, the city was a ruin, and the threat of civil war loomed. Even as British troops arrived, Alice remained focused on the immediate needs of the population. She walked the streets during the Decembriana, the violent clashes between communist and government forces, to distribute rations, even when snipers were active. When warned about the danger, she replied with characteristic dry wit and courage. "They tell me that you don't hear the shot that kills you, and anyway I am deaf. So why worry?" To her, the mission was more important than her own survival. Following the war, Alice's spiritual journey took a definitive turn. Inspired by her aunt, the martyred Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, she decided to found a nursing order of Greek Orthodox nuns. In 1949, she established the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary on the island of Tinos. She envisioned an order that would not just pray in isolation, but would actively serve the sick and the poor in the community. She had finally found a way to bridge her royal heritage with her deep desire for religious service, creating a sanctuary for those the world had forgotten. Alice's transition to the monastic life was absolute. She discarded the last vestiges of her royal finery, trading silk for rough wool and diamonds for a simple wooden cross. She lived a life of extreme austerity, often sleeping on a hard bed and eating the simplest of meals. Her daughters were stunned by her transformation, but for Alice it was the culmination of a lifelong search for authenticity. In the silence of her order, she found a voice that resonates louder than any royal proclamation. She was no longer a princess by title alone, but a woman of God by conviction and sacrifice. In 1953, Alice traveled to London for the coronation of her daughter-in-law, Queen Elizabeth II. Amidst the sea of velvet, ermine, and glittering crowns in Westminster Abbey, Alice was a striking and humble figure. She attended the ceremony wearing her simple, floor-length gray nun's habit and a flowing veil. It was a powerful visual statement that contrasted the temporal power of the monarchy with the eternal values she had chosen to live by. She sat amongst the highest nobility of Europe, a princess nun whose presence reminded everyone that true greatness is found in humility and service to others. By 1967, following a military coup in Greece, Alice's health began to fail, and she was persuaded by her son, Prince Philip, to return to London. She moved into Buckingham Palace, where she spent the final years of her life. Despite being in the heart of the British monarchy, she remained the same humble woman, often seen wandering the corridors in her habit, smoking her favorite Woodbine cigarettes. She stayed close to her son and his family, a quiet, grandmotherly figure whose extraordinary life of bravery and sacrifice was a source of quiet awe for the younger royals who now surrounded her. In the quiet, wood-paneled rooms of Buckingham Palace, Princess Alice lived a life of profound simplicity that contrasted sharply with the grandeur surrounding her. She occupied a modest suite, where the air often carried the faint scent of Woodbine cigarettes and old books. Though she was the mother of the Duke of Edinburgh and mother-in-law to the Queen, she sought no special treatment. She spent her days reading and reflecting, a silent witness to the changing tides of the British monarchy. Her presence was a bridge to a forgotten era, a living relic of European royalty who had seen empires crumble and wars consume continents. The younger generation of the royal family, particularly Prince Charles and Princess Anne, found themselves drawn to their enigmatic grandmother. In the evenings, they would sit with her, listening as she shared stories of the past, often communicating through a mixture of lip reading and handwritten notes. Alice spoke of her childhood in Windsor, her life in Greece, and the harrowing years of the war. To the young royals, she was not just a grandmother, but a figure of mystery and resilience. Her tales were devoid of self-pity, focusing instead on the duty one owed to humanity, regardless of their station in life. As the late 1960s progressed, Alice's health began to decline more rapidly. The physical toll of her years of service, poverty, and displacement finally began to catch up with her. Despite her frailty, she maintained her sharp mind and her independent spirit. She rarely complained about her ailments, preferring to remain a quiet observer of the palace's daily rhythms. The palace staff grew fond of the nun princess, who would often be found wandering the corridors at odd hours, her silent footsteps echoing on the polished floors. She was a ghost of the past, preparing for her final transition. Even as her body weakened, Alice remained deeply concerned for the world outside the palace walls. She followed the news of the world with keen interest, her heart still tethered to the suffering of those in Greece and beyond. Her son, Prince Philip, visited her daily, their bond strengthened by the hardships they had shared and the long years of separation they had endured. In these private moments, the Duke of Edinburgh was not a public figure, but a devoted son, tending to the woman who had survived so much. Their conversations were quiet, filled with the weight of unsaid history. Aware that her time was drawing to a close, Alice made her final wishes known with characteristic clarity and lack of sentimentality. She did not wish for a grand state funeral or a permanent resting place in the royal vaults of Windsor. Instead, she expressed a deep desire to be buried in Jerusalem at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives. This was where her beloved aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, who had also been a nun and a martyr, was interred. Alice wished to return to the land she found spiritually fulfilling, far from the cold formality of London. On December 5, 1969, Princess Alice of Battenberg passed away peacefully in her sleep at Buckingham Palace. She was 84 years old. Her death marked the end of an extraordinary journey that had spanned the heights of royal privilege and the depths of human suffering. At the time of her passing, she owned almost nothing. She had given away her jewels, her clothes, and her money to the poor throughout her life. The world outside the palace remained largely unaware that a woman of such immense courage and hidden heroism had just departed from the stage of history. Following her death, a funeral service was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The British royal family gathered to pay their respects to a woman whose life had been a testament to faith and resilience. Her coffin was initially placed in the royal vault beneath the chapel. However, the family was well aware of her final wish to be buried in Jerusalem. At the time, political tensions in the Middle East and diplomatic complexities made fulfilling her request difficult. For nearly 2 decades, Alice's body remained in Windsor, waiting for the journey she had so fervently desired to take. During the years her remains rested in Windsor, the story of Alice's bravery during the Holocaust began to emerge from the shadows. The family she had saved, the Cohens, spoke of her kindness and her refusal to be intimidated by the Gestapo. Historians began to piece together the fragments of her life, revealing a woman who was much more than a deaf princess or a reclusive nun. She was increasingly recognized as a hero who had risked everything for the sake of others. The legacy of Princess Alice began to grow, transforming from a family secret into a story of international significance. Finally, in 1988, the diplomatic hurdles were overcome, and Alice's wishes were fulfilled. Her remains were transported from London to Jerusalem. In a quiet and moving ceremony, she was interred at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives, as she had requested decades earlier. She was finally laid to rest near her Aunt Ella, overlooking the ancient city of Jerusalem. The setting was a fitting tribute to a woman who had spent her life seeking peace and serving the divine, far removed from the royal courts of Europe that had once been her home. In 1993, the ultimate recognition of her courage came when Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Israel, posthumously honored Princess Alice as righteous among the nations. This prestigious title is given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Her son, Prince Philip, and her daughter, Princess George of Hanover, traveled to Jerusalem to plant a tree in her memory. Philip remarked that his mother was a person of deep religious faith who considered her protection of the Cohens to be a perfectly natural human action in the face of suffering. At the Yad Vashem ceremony, Prince Philip stood beneath the Mediterranean sun, yet his mind was tethered to the cold, dangerous nights of occupied Athens. He spoke of a woman who never sought praise, for whom bravery was as quiet as her world of silence. The recognition as righteous among the nations was not just a title, but a historical vindication. For decades, the world saw a troubled princess, but here, she was finally seen as a protector. Alice had transformed her own suffering into a shield for others, proving that true royalty is defined by service, not status. Researchers and historians began to piece together the fragments of Alice's life, sifting through yellowed letters and suppressed diaries. They found evidence of a woman who navigated the highest echelons of European royalty while remaining profoundly isolated by her deafness and her spiritual calling. The mystery of Alice began to unfurl, a narrative of a princess who sold her jewels to feed the poor and stood her ground against the Gestapo. Each document revealed a layer of a complex soul who chose the shadows of a convent over the spotlight of Buckingham Palace, seeking a different kind of kingdom. Before her death in 1969, Princess Alice had made a request that initially shocked the British royal family. She wished to be buried not in the royal vaults of Windsor, but in Jerusalem, at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives. This was the resting place of her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, a martyr of the Russian Revolution. Alice sought a final connection to the woman who had inspired her own path of religious devotion and self-sacrifice. Her request was a final act of independence, choosing a spiritual home over a dynastic one. It took nearly 20 years for her final wish to be fully realized. In 1988, her remains were moved from the royal crypt at St. George's Chapel to the golden-domed church in Gethsemane. The journey of her casket across continents mirrored the fractured nature of her own life. Born in Windsor, living in Greece, and finding peace in the Holy Land. As her body was lowered into the crypt, the circle of her tumultuous life finally closed. She was no longer the forgotten princess or the eccentric nun. She was a woman who had finally come home to the soil of her faith. The Church of St. Mary Magdalene, with its distinctive Russian onion domes, stands as a silent sentinel over the Kidron Valley. Inside its cool, incense-scented halls, Alice found the serenity that had eluded her for so much of her life. The atmosphere is thick with history and the weight of ancestral tragedies. Here, the noise of the world is replaced by the soft flicker of candles and the rhythmic chanting of the liturgy. It is a place where royalty and divinity intersect, reflecting the two worlds Alice inhabited throughout her long and often misunderstood journey through the 20th century. Alice's bond with her Aunt Ella, the Grand Duchess, was a thread of gold through the dark tapestry of her life. Ella had founded the Martha and Mary Convent in Moscow before being murdered by Bolsheviks in 1918. Alice had followed in those footsteps, founding her own order of nursing nuns. By choosing to be buried near Ella, Alice was reaffirming her commitment to the path of the righteous. Their shared legacy was one of profound empathy for the suffering, a belief that the greatest privilege of royalty was the capacity to serve those who had nothing left but hope. To the world, she was a princess of Battenberg in Greece, the mother of the Duke of Edinburgh. But in her heart, she was simply Sister Alice Elizabeth. She had abandoned the silks and tiaras of her youth for the heavy gray wool of a nun's habit. Her life was a study in minimalism, a small room, a few religious icons, and the constant presence of prayer. This transition was not a sign of madness, as some had cruelly suggested, but a deliberate shedding of the superficial. She sought the still small voice of God, which she could hear more clearly than any earthly sound. There is a poignant irony in the images of Alice at the 1953 coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Amidst the glittering jewels and velvet robes of the aristocracy, Alice stood out in her simple, austere nun's habit. She was a reminder of the spiritual core that should underlie the temporal power of the crown. While others celebrated the dawn of a new Elizabethan era with opulence, Alice represented the endurance of faith through war and exile. She was a figure from another time, yet her presence provided a moral anchor for a family navigating a rapidly changing world. The legacy of Princess Alice continues to ripple through the British royal family today. Her commitment to humanitarian causes and her refusal to be silenced by her disability paved the way for future generations. King Charles III has often spoken of his grandmother with profound admiration, visiting her grave in Jerusalem to honor her memory. Her story serves as a correction to the often shallow portrayal of royal life, emphasizing that the most impactful acts are often those done in private, without expectation of reward. she remains a symbol of resilience, showing that even in silence, one can speak volumes. Princess Alice of Battenberg was, by all accounts, an unconventional princess. She lived through the collapse of empires, the horrors of 2 world wars, and the personal trials of mental illness and deafness. Yet, she emerged not as a victim, but as a heroine of the human spirit. Her life was a testament to the fact that determination and bravery are not the absence of fear or struggle, but the triumph over them. As we look back on her journey, we see a woman who was truly righteous, whose life was a quiet, steady flame of compassion in a dark century. In the twilight of her life, Princess Alice returned to the country of her birth, living out her days at Buckingham Palace at the invitation of her son, Prince Philip. Despite the royal surroundings, she remained steadfast in her commitment to simplicity and service. She lived in a modest room, shunning the luxuries offered to her by the crown. Her presence was a silent anchor for the royal family, a woman who had witnessed the rise and fall of kings and chosen the path of a humble nun. Her deafness was no longer a barrier, but a dignified silence that commanded respect. Alice's final years were spent in quiet reflection, often seen smoking her favorite Woodbine cigarettes while gazing out over the London skyline. She possessed almost no worldly belongings, having given everything she owned to the poor in Greece during her years of service. Her son, Philip, and her grandchildren found in her a source of wisdom and unspeakable strength. She was a living bridge between the Victorian era and the modern world, carrying the scars of history with a grace that transcended her many personal tragedies. She was the grandmother who had survived the storms of the century. On December 5th, 1969, Princess Alice passed away peacefully at Buckingham Palace. She left behind no grand estate and no riches, only a few personal items and a legacy of extraordinary courage. Before her passing, she had left a simple, moving note for her son, expressing her love and her readiness to depart this world. Her death was as quiet as her later years had been, the final chapter of a long journey through exile, war, and spiritual seeking. The palace mourned a woman who had been more of a saint than a traditional princess of the realm. Initially, Alice was interred in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. However, her true final wish was far more humble and spiritually significant. She had requested to be buried in Jerusalem, next to her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, who had also dedicated her life to the service of the poor before being killed in the Russian Revolution. This request initially posed significant diplomatic challenges between nations. For years, her body remained in Windsor, but the story of the princess who saved Jewish lives continued to grow, whispering through the corridors of history like a persistent wind. Alice's wish was finally honored in 1988, nearly 20 years after her death. Her remains were transported to the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. This was the place where she felt most at home, a place of spiritual peace far from the political storms of Europe. As her casket was carried through the ancient, sun-drenched streets, it was a symbolic homecoming for a woman who had always been an outsider. She was a wanderer who had finally found her purpose and her rest in the most sacred and difficult corners of human existence. In 1993, the world officially recognized the bravery Alice had shown during the Nazi occupation of Athens. She was posthumously named Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem, the highest honor Israel bestows upon non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. At the ceremony, Prince Philip spoke of his mother's actions, noting that she never considered her bravery to be anything special. To Alice, saving the Cohen family was simply what a human being was supposed to do for another, regardless of the risk, the cost, or the surrounding darkness of the war. During the ceremony in Jerusalem, Prince Philip remarked that it never occurred to his mother that her action was in any way special. She was a person with deep religious faith who considered it a totally natural human reaction to help fellow beings in distress. This simple statement captured the essence of Alice's character. She did not seek glory, medals, or recognition. She acted out of a profound, innate sense of duty and compassion. Her life was a testament to the power of individual conscience standing firm against the overwhelming tide of systemic evil and human suffering. Princess Alice's story is one of ultimate transformation. She began as a princess of great beauty and high rank, faced the isolating silence of deafness, endured the pain of mental illness, and survived the chaos of 2 world wars. Through it all, she forged an identity that was entirely her own, independent of the crowns she wore. She was the princess who became a nun, the royal who became a servant of the poor, and the woman who became a hero. Her life serves as a reminder that our struggles do not define us, but our responses do. Today, she is remembered as a woman of immense moral clarity. In a century defined by noise, propaganda, and the clamor of war, the deaf princess listened to the quiet voice of her own conscience. She reminds us that bravery is often found in small, hidden acts of kindness and the refusal to turn away from the suffering of others. Her legacy is a steady flame that continues to burn, lighting the way for those who choose compassion over convenience and courage over complicity. She was truly a light in the dark, a righteous soul in a fractured world. As we conclude the story of Princess Alice of Battenberg, we see a life that came full circle. From the courts of Europe to the streets of Athens and finally to the sacred ground of Jerusalem, her journey was one of profound spiritual growth. She proved that even in the most broken of lives, there is a capacity for extraordinary beauty and resilience. Alice remains an inspiration, a woman who was deaf to the world's prejudices but perfectly attuned to its needs. Her story is a timeless reminder that the greatest power on earth is a brave and loving heart.